3 days ago, something happened in the Persian Gulf that the mainstream media completely buried under a headline about a ceasefire. What I am about to tell you is not the version you heard. It is not the version that was packaged in a government briefing room and delivered to journalists who read it back to their audiences as if it were fact. What you heard was a press release. What I am going to give you is the architecture underneath it. Because right now, as we are having this conversation, there are military assets repositioning near one of the most critical energy choke points on the planet. There are intelligence services sending signals through actions rather than words. And there are governments staying completely silent in a way that, if you know how to read it, is the loudest thing happening in this entire situation. So if you came here for the comfortable version, this is not that. But if you want to understand what is actually unfolding in the Middle East right now, and why it matters not just to the region, but to every economy, every energy market, and every household on Earth, stay with me. Because the next few minutes are going to change how you see this entirely. On the same day, a ceasefire was announced with enormous fanfare, with cameras rolling and officials smiling and markets responding. An attack occurred near Kuwait. And the reason that sequence matters, the reason the timing of those two events is the single most important piece of information in this entire story, is because at the level of state power, at the level of intelligence operations and military commands and strategic signaling, nothing happens by accident. The order of events is the message. And when you understand what Kuwait actually represents in the global energy architecture, the message being sent near its borders on the same day a ceasefire was being celebrated becomes something that should stop every serious analyst cold. Kuwait sits at the top of the Persian Gulf. It shares a border with Iraq. It neighbors Saudi Arabia, and the waters around it are part of the most consequential energy corridor in the history of modern civilization. We are not talking about a regional footnote. We are talking about the physical geography through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves. 1/5 of everything that powers the global economy passes through or near this region. That is not a statistic. That is leverage. And an attack near Kuwait is not a local incident. It is a signal transmitted in the one language that every government, every central bank, and every energy market in the world reads without translation. The language of disruption, the language of, we can reach this, and you know it. Now I want to talk about something that almost every analyst got wrong in their initial read of this week's events. When the ceasefire was announced, oil prices did not spike. They fell. And I want you to think about that carefully, because it is counterintuitive in a way that only resolves when you abandon the surface narrative. If this ceasefire represented genuine, durable, structural peace in the Gulf, then yes, falling oil prices make sense. Less conflict means more stable supply means lower prices. That is a textbook response. But here is the question that the financial press almost universally failed to ask. Who gets hurt most specifically, most immediately, and most severely by a sharp drop in crude oil prices? The answer is Iran. Not abstractly. Iran runs on oil revenue in a way that is not a metaphor. The Iranian government's ability to fund its domestic operations, to maintain any form of social stability inside a country living under crushing sanctions, and to sustain the network of proxy relationships it has built across the region. All of that depends on a price per barrel that keeps the treasury functional. When crude falls hard and fast, Iran does not just lose money. It loses operational capacity. It loses the financial oxygen that keeps its regional influence alive. And I am not going to tell you definitively that the price drop was engineered. What I am going to tell you is that when a sequence of events produces an outcome where the party that gave up the most in a negotiation immediately suffers a severe fiscal blow as a direct consequence of the market reaction, the analytical response is not to shrug and call it coincidence. The analytical response is to ask who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity, and then follow that question wherever it leads. Because using economic pressure as a strategic weapon is not a theory. It is a well-documented, extensively practiced feature of American foreign policy, with a history stretching back decades. Sanctions regimes, coordinated market pressure, these are tools. They are documented in foreign policy literature, in congressional records, in the memoirs of the officials who deployed them. Let me turn to Saudi Arabia now, because Riyadh's position in this moment is more complicated and more important than almost anyone is acknowledging publicly. The entire social contract inside the kingdom depends on oil revenue staying within a specific price range. The infrastructure projects, the Vision 2030 reform agenda, the attempt to build an economy that does not collapse the moment oil revenue dips, all of it is calibrated around that number. When crude falls below that range too quickly, it does not just create market turbulence. It creates genuine political pressure inside one of the most strategically important and simultaneously most internally fragile governments in the entire region. And political pressure inside Saudi Arabia does not stay inside Saudi Arabia. It radiates outward into every corner of Gulf security in ways that are rarely discussed openly but are understood with crystalline clarity by anyone who has worked seriously in that environment. The Saudis are not bystanders watching this drama unfold. They are active participants with their own calculations running in real time, and those calculations do not automatically align with what Washington announced from a podium. There is something else not getting nearly enough attention. The silence from Tel Aviv on this agreement is not neutral. It is not diplomatic courtesy. It is a signal. Anyone who understands how Israeli strategic communication works knows that silence at a moment like this carries enormous informational content. Israel has been consistently clear that any ceasefire framework that does not include concrete, verifiable, and permanent constraints on Iranian nuclear development is not a solution. From Israel's perspective, it is a pause, a window that creates time and space for an adversary to regroup, to reposition, to advance capabilities that directly threaten Israeli survival. And Israel has demonstrated, repeatedly and without apology, that it will act on its own security assessments unilaterally, regardless of what a diplomatic agreement says, regardless of what Washington prefers. The Israeli Air Force does not issue press releases before it moves. It defines its red lines internally, monitors its adversaries continuously, and when it assesses that a threshold has been crossed, it acts. That operational reality did not change because someone held a press conference this week. And any framework that does not account for Israel's capacity and willingness to act independently is a framework with a structural crack running through it from the moment it was signed. Now let me place all of this inside the larger competition happening in the background, because the immediate events of this week only make full sense when you understand it. That competition is between Washington and Beijing over who gets to set the rules in the most energy-critical region on Earth. China brokered a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that had been on the edge of open conflict for years, representing the central fault line of Sunni-Shia tension in the Gulf, sat down with Chinese mediators and restored diplomatic relations. Beijing worked the back channels with patience and precision and produced a diplomatic outcome that Washington had failed to produce for years. What it meant was this: the era in which the United States automatically occupies the position of primary power broker in the Middle East is over as a guaranteed state of affairs. It is being actively contested, and the party contesting it most effectively is not doing it with military force. It is doing it with trade relationships, infrastructure investment, and a long-term strategic vision that does not reset every 4 years with an election cycle. While the United States was spending 20 years and trillions of dollars in Afghanistan and Iraq, consuming enormous political capital and military resources, China was building, quietly, consistently, energy contracts with Gulf producers, port agreements, infrastructure running through the region, none of it announced with fanfare, just a slow, patient accumulation of influence through deals that made economic sense to the parties involved. And now a ceasefire announcement lands in a geopolitical landscape where American influence has been declining, where Beijing has already demonstrated it can deliver what Washington could not, and where regional powers are making calculations that no longer automatically defer to what the United States wants. That context does not make the ceasefire meaningless, but it absolutely shapes what it means. And what it means, viewed honestly, looks less like a triumph and more like an attempt to reclaim relevance in a landscape that has been shifting for years. Here's what matters most as we watch what happens next. The fundamental drivers of instability in the Gulf did not disappear with this announcement. Iranian support for proxy forces across the region did not end. Hezbollah remains armed and organized. The Houthis in Yemen remain operational. Militia networks in Iraq and Syria, aligned with Iranian strategic interests, remain in place. The political and sectarian tensions that created the conditions for those proxy relationships have not been addressed because they cannot be addressed by a ceasefire document. They are rooted in historical grievance and in the very rational security calculations of a state that watched the United States dismantle governments on both of its borders and spent the following 20 years making certain it would never be next. I am not defending every decision Iran has made. I am explaining the logic that produced those decisions, because if you do not understand the logic, you cannot assess whether any agreement is capable of actually changing the behavior. There is a pattern in Middle East diplomacy that has repeated itself enough times to constitute something close to a law. Agreements constructed to be announced rather than implemented. Frameworks built around language, vague enough that every party can claim it supports their position. And the question that cuts through all of the official optimism surrounding any such announcement is always the same. Who is buying time and what do they intend to do with it? Because in geopolitics, a pause is not neutral. Time is a resource. The party that uses the pause most effectively, that repositions, that resupplies, that advances its strategic situation while international attention is focused on the diplomatic performance, that party ends up in a stronger position when the pause ends. And the pause always ends. Watch what happens on the ground near Kuwait over the next several days, not what officials say about it, what actually happens. Watch whether Iranian leadership makes statements that genuinely and specifically embrace the terms of this agreement, or whether they speak in the careful hedge language of parties who have signed something they understand to be provisional. Watch the oil markets. Those signals will tell you more about the real structural stability of the ceasefire than any amount of official commentary from any government involved. Because the truth of a diplomatic agreement is never in the document. It is in the behavior of the parties in the weeks and months after the cameras have moved on. The weapons shipment that does or does not happen. The military positioning that does or does not change. The back-channel communication that does or does not include. The kind of concrete assurances that separate a real agreement from a performance. Right now in the Gulf, the available evidence points toward a situation that is being managed rather than resolved, held together by the mutual interest of multiple parties in not having the optics of an immediate collapse, rather than by any deep structural change in the underlying conflict. That is not pessimism, that is pattern recognition. And the value of pattern recognition in a world this complex is not that it lets you predict exactly what happens next. It is that it keeps you from being surprised when the version of events that was never fully true finally stops holding together. The surface says peace, the structure says watch carefully. And in geopolitics, the structure is always right.